All right, gentlemen, with that, let us move directly on to shout outs and rants. We're going to keep the same lineup. Mr. Armstrong, what do you have for us today?
As I said, I was in Berlin last week and I had a really interesting email from our good friend Adam Turtletaub. And that sort of set me thinking. Adam was saying almost when you're in Berlin, look out for the way in which they deal with the terrible events of the Second World War. And obviously, 80 years later, the German people are still apologizing. Now, nobody's saying they shouldn't, but it's interesting the way in which Berlin is set up. It has a Holocaust memorial on prime real estate in the center of town. This isn't something that's pushed away into a suburb or in some field in a park somewhere. And not only is there a Holocaust memorial, there's memorials to other minorities oppressed by the Nazi regime. And there's also recognition, which was still untainted despite feelings about Russia, to the Russian soldiers that died in the invasion of Berlin. And Adam's point, I think, is interesting in a corporate context. That's a level of ownership, it's an element of authenticity. I went to the Reichstag Sonne Lumiere display, or the Donner und Blitzen, whatever is the German for Sonne Lumiere, which I'd recommend to everybody. It's a sort of an objective and honest view of German history since the war and the split and the reunification. But as I say, Adam's point was a really good one. If a nation can still 80 years later deal sensitively with its part in really bad times, why can't modern corporations do that about events that happened a week or 2 weeks ago? Why are we in this culture of corporations thinking that they'll double down in a crisis rather than confessing, apologizing, and moving on?
Matt Kelly.
I have both a shout out and a rant. I'll start with my shout out. I want to give a big shout out to the people of Ukraine, not just for continuing their fight against Russia, which I will happily shout out every day, but this particular week, I was really just so surprised and delighted to see that they took to the streets to protest a gutting of anti-corruption powers within the Ukraine government. And the Ukrainian parliament had signed a law that was going to undermine the independence of the anti-corruption authorities there. Nobody liked that because Ukraine's corruption is almost as bad as what we see in Russia and elsewhere. It has had corruption problems for decades, and it had been working mightily to rectify that over the last decade or so. And then the Ukraine lawmakers decide to reverse that. People took to the streets in the many thousands while there is a war on. And President Zelensky rapidly realized he made a mistake here and is now supporting legislation to repeal that legislation that had been passed 3 days ago. Now they're going to walk it back and give more independence back to the anti-corruption investigators and offices there. Good for them. It shows what a serious approach to corruption looks like. Which brings me to my rant closer to home. I have to rant about the Justice Department here in the United States, was just not so out of control lately about trying to cover up every single thing it can over Jeffrey Epstein. It is quite clear to everybody. Donald Trump was a friend of Jeffrey Epstein for a long time. There are some people who now say actually Epstein was the one who dumped him in the early 2000s because Epstein thought he was the crook. I mean, yes, Trump was. However, if even Jeffrey Epstein, a now deceased pimp and pervert, actually thinks that you're the bad news, I don't want to hang out with you, that's really saying something. But what are we doing here, people? Clearly, there is a lot of information about Jeffrey Epstein that could come out. And Republicans talked about it for a long time. They talked about it in the terms of Bill Clinton and whoever else might have been palling around with Epstein. Would I like to see all that come out? Yes. However, now suddenly we realize, oh crap, This might implicate our boss in the White House too, as if anybody in the world doesn't know that Trump is a sexual predator who likes to run around with at least inappropriately young age women, if not flat out underage women, and he's done it in the past. Come on. We all know this. We all know that AG Pam Bondi and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche are trying to cover for him and trying to find a way out for him so that they can maybe release files that make everybody else look bad, but not the boss. That's never going to happen. They should have appointed a special prosecutor months ago to get to the bottom of this. They're never going to, because that would just cause Donald Trump to stroke out before he fires Pam Bondi for doing that. So they're going to try and do this cover up, like Todd Blanche going to meet with Zane Maxwell in prison to do what? To do a fact-finding mission? Please, come on. Unless they release a full videotape of the interview he had with Maxwell, we have to assume that the deputy AG, who was Donald Trump's previous personal attorney, looks like he's still acting in that capacity to me right now, that he is basically going to try to offer her a deal that you say, oh yeah, everybody everywhere was all guilty except for Trump. He was great. And Trump's going to give her a pardon. And we all know these are the mechanisms they would love to put into place, and they're desperately trying to, and it's ridiculous. Enough. This is just shameful. Bondi and Blanche both are just like, you can't even begin to say how badly they are mishandling this. It's words fail me. All evidence to the contrary, because I just blew a gasket for the last 3 minutes. But that's all.
Mr. Marks, the bar is very high.
I'm not gonna rant today. I'm actually gonna give a little bit of a selfless plug to something that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago. But I sent my comments into COSO with regards to their governance attempt at putting together some guidance for governance, which I thought was pretty good. So I did send them in. Whether they get them and read them is another story. But after going back and reading some of this stuff, including some of these enforcement releases and some of the things that you all write on a regular and ongoing basis, I keep going back to this whole concept of leadership. And are we really training our leaders the right way? And I had mentioned a book that I read a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you could see it, but it's called Graceful Leadership. And it's written by this woman, and her name is Alexsys Thompson. And it's all dog-eared for me and underlined, and I have things circled in here. And I am telling you, I reached out to her, and I'm having a dialogue with her, and I think she's actually going to come out with a program on this. But this is not a piece of work that should be in every boardroom. I don't know what should be, because everything I have else on my bookshelf doesn't really pale in comparison to what she writes in this particular book. If you haven't read The Power of Graceful Leadership by Alexsys Thompson, I think you're missing out on something. I've read it 4 times already. I have extensive notes in here, but there are such great lessons learned in here and such great teaching opportunities in here. I'm very excited that she's going to take this on the road and create some type of program, but it really is a fantastic book and a lot of great lessons in here for people that are up and coming leaders or sitting on boards. Another plug for Alexsys Thompson.
All right, I am going to give a shout out to the Lincoln Center Starbucks. I was in New York on July 7th, which was 3 days after the flood in Houston. I'm a very early morning riser, so up at 5, Starbucks opens at 5:30. I'm there at 5:31, and I am greeted by the following sign on the counter, rich red. American Red Cross and the Starbucks Foundation support the people affected by the Texas floods. Join us in helping communities recover from the disaster. Donate at the register or by scanning the QR code. That was on the counter, and that just blew me away. And so I asked the manager, I said, how did this get here? And she just looked at me and said, corporate is great about this. When there's a disaster, they got something to us the next day. And so I got to talk to her and told her I was there for a few days. And I went back the next day at 5:31 a.m. and she knew what I wanted, remembered my order. By the third day, we're on a first name basis. And she was a delightful woman. I'd grown up in the city, moved upstate, but back to the city, and loved working at Starbucks. Full benefits, a manager, knew her crew. They were like family, but the whole Starbucks was like family. So I want to shout out to the Lincoln Center Starbucks for making a Texan feel very at home for 3 days in July in New York City. So, gentlemen, with that, we had a very successful
Sounds like, Tom, sounds like she has
Vente art. Extra bold.
Actually, I don't know if you saw that, but if you actually take the cups and look at the volume of the cups and pour them into the smaller cup, they all basically fit in the smaller cup. So if you buy the Vente, you should buy the smaller one because it's the same volume of coffee.
On that note, gentlemen, I can't wait to see what we can come up with next time.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day, one actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network, available wherever you listen to podcasts.